Imagine you are a paramedic working the day shift for the New York City Fire Department. It is 12:14 p.m. on a brisk Tuesday in October. You are stationed in the financial district, parked a block away from the New York Stock Exchange. The sidewalks are packed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of people rushing to grab lunch. Suddenly, a frantic 911 call comes over the radio. A man has collapsed on the pavement at the corner of Wall Street and Broad. You hit the sirens. You fight through the dense crowd of tourists and bankers. When you reach the corner, you find a man in a bespoke $5,000 suit lying flat on his back. His face is pale. He isn't breathing. You rip open his tailored shirt to attach the defibrillator pads. When you do, you see a small, raised surgical scar over his collarbone. He has an artificial pacemaker. You check his pulse. Nothing. You check the pacemaker's internal defibrillator. It isn't firing. Despite 20 minutes of aggressive CPR right there on the concrete, the man is pronounced dead at the scene. The NYPD identifies him immediately. His name is Richard Vance. He is a billionaire hedge fund CEO who has been on the front page of the Wall Street Journal all week, accused of liquidating his clients' retirement funds to cover his own massive gambling debts. The coroner takes the body to the morgue. The initial ruling is completely straightforward. Vance suffered a massive heart attack, and his aging pacemaker experienced a tragic, simultaneous mechanical failure. A stroke of terrible medical luck. But 3 days later, the medical examiner is cataloging Vance's personal effects. He picks up the watch that was removed from Vance's left wrist. It is an ultra-rare $2 million Patek Philippe Grand Complication. It is a masterpiece of Swiss engineering. It does not take a battery. It runs entirely on the kinetic movement of a tightly wound mechanical spring. The medical examiner notices the second hand is completely frozen. He looks at the time displayed on the dial. The watch stopped ticking at exactly 12:14 p.m. The precise second Richard Vance hit the pavement. A mechanical watch doesn't stop when a man's heart stops. The NYPD suddenly realizes they aren't looking at a medical tragedy. They are looking at the most sophisticated, terrifying assassination in the history of Wall Street. Chapter 1. The Broad Daylight Collapse. To understand the absolute audacity of this murder, you have to understand the environment where it took place. The corner of Wall and Broad in Lower Manhattan is one of the most heavily surveilled intersections on the planet. Post-9/11 security measures mean there are overlapping NYPD cameras, private bank cameras, and federal monitoring systems recording every square inch of the pavement. Richard Vance was not a man who walked alone. He was currently the target of a massive federal probe by the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. He was accused of operating a shadow ledger, essentially stealing $2 billion from blue-collar pension funds to cover his catastrophic losses in foreign currency markets. He was hated. He was receiving daily death threats. Yet at 12:10 p.m., Vance left his towering office building flanked by 2 private bodyguards. Security footage captured his final moments in perfect high-definition clarity. Vance was walking briskly, holding a coffee. His bodyguards were perfectly positioned. One a few steps ahead, one trailing behind. No one bumped into him. No one handed him a poisoned umbrella. There was no sniper fire, no sound of a gunshot, no panic in the crowd. At exactly 12:14 and 32 seconds, Vance simply stopped walking. His eyes rolled back into his head, his coffee cup hit the concrete, and he collapsed perfectly flat onto his back. His bodyguards instantly drew their concealed weapons, scanning the crowd for a threat. But there was no threat to shoot. Their boss had simply dropped dead from the inside out. To the homicide detectives reviewing the tape, it looked exactly like a natural sudden cardiac arrest. But the frozen Patek Philippe watch, sitting in the NYPD evidence locker, demanded a second look. Chapter 2. The $2 million Clue. Detective Marcus Reed, a veteran of the NYPD's Financial Crimes and Homicide Divisions, signed the watch out of evidence. A $2 million Patek Philippe is not a normal piece of jewelry. It is a microscopic symphony of hundreds of tiny, hand-polished steel gears, springs, and levers. Because it is completely mechanical, it is not affected by water, minor shocks, or the biological state of the wearer. As long as it is wound, it ticks. Detective Reed took the watch to a master horologist, a high-end watchmaker, in the Diamond District. The horologist placed the watch under a massive magnifying lens and carefully removed the sapphire crystal caseback. He inspected the delicate balance wheel and the microscopic hairspring that regulates the time. The horologist looked up, completely baffled. "The watch isn't broken," he told the detective. "The gears aren't shattered. The mainspring is fully wound. But the metal is completely seized." The horologist took a tiny compass and held it next to the watch. The needle on the compass instantly whipped around, pointing violently toward the Patek Philippe. The watch had become highly magnetized. The horologist explained the physics. Inside a mechanical watch, the tiny steel hairspring coils back and forth to keep time. If the watch is exposed to a massive magnetic field, the steel coils become magnetized and instantly stick together. The watch freezes exactly in place, seizing the entire movement in a fraction of a second. To magnetize a watch this heavily, the horologist said, Vance would have had to stick his arm inside an industrial MRI machine. If he was just walking down the street, this is physically impossible. Chapter 3. The Invisible Bullet. Detective Reed rushed the autopsy report to the FBI's Cyberterrorism Division. If Vance's mechanical watch had been subjected to a massive localized magnetic field at the exact second he died, they needed to look closer at the pacemaker that failed to save his life. The FBI removed the pacemaker from Vance's chest cavity and brought it into a specialized electronics lab. A standard pacemaker is a simple, highly insulated computer. If it fails naturally, the battery dies or a wire comes loose. But when the FBI cracked open Vance's pacemaker, they found a nightmare. The internal microchip wasn't just short-circuited. The microscopic silicon pathways were physically scorched. The memory was completely wiped. The internal battery had violently discharged all of its energy in a single millisecond. The FBI lead engineer placed the fried pacemaker next to the magnetized watch. "Vance didn't have a heart attack," the engineer said grimly. "He was shot, but not with a bullet." The killer had used a highly focused military-grade electromagnetic pulse, an EMP. An EMP weapon generates a massive, invisible wave of electromagnetic energy. If you fire it at a car, it fries the engine's computer. If you fire it at a human being with an electronic pacemaker, it instantly supercharges the medical device, completely destroying the circuitry and triggering a massive, fatal cardiac arrest. The assassination was an absolute stroke of genius. The EMP wave is completely invisible. It is completely silent. It passes right through human tissue without leaving a burn mark, a bullet hole, or a drop of poison in the bloodstream. It makes a brutal assassination look exactly like a tragic natural medical failure. But the killer made one tiny, arrogant mistake. They knew Vance had a pacemaker, but they didn't know he was wearing a $2 million mechanical watch. The killer didn't realize that the massive magnetic pulse required to fry the pacemaker would also instantly magnetize the tiny steel gears on his wrist, leaving an undeniable permanent magnetic fingerprint that proved a weapon had been fired. Chapter 4. The Phantom Van. The FBI now knew they were hunting an assassin armed with a localized EMP rifle. But an EMP powerful enough to fry a pacemaker from a distance is not a handgun you can hide in a jacket. It requires massive capacitors, heavy copper coils, and a massive power source. The killer couldn't have been walking on the sidewalk. They had to be inside a vehicle. The NYPD and FBI set up a massive joint task force. They pulled the footage from all 47 security cameras covering the intersection of Wall and Broad on the day of the murder. Because EMP energy dissipates incredibly fast over distance, the FBI physicists calculated the weapon had to have been fired from within 50 feet of Richard Vance. Detectives meticulously mapped every single vehicle that passed through that 50-foot kill zone at exactly 12:14 p.m. The intersection was jammed with taxis, armored bank trucks, and delivery vehicles. But one vehicle stood out. It was a faded white unmarked commercial utility van. It looked like a standard plumbing or electrical truck. The security cameras captured the van idling at a red light on Broad Street. At 12:14 p.m., Richard Vance walked exactly parallel to the side panel of the van. At that exact second, the camera footage glitched. The digital feed from the street camera violently distorted into static for precisely 2 seconds before snapping back to normal. When the static cleared, Vance was falling to the pavement and the white van was accelerating away through the yellow light. The EMP blast hadn't just killed Vance and frozen his watch. The edge of the magnetic wave had briefly scrambled the digital street camera. The FBI had their sniper's nest. Chapter 5. The Wall Street Motive. Detectives zoomed in on the license plate of the white van. Unsurprisingly, it was a stolen plate registered to a Honda Civic sitting in a junkyard in Queens. The physical van was a ghost. To find the killer, the FBI had to look at the motive. Who had the millions of dollars required to purchase or build a highly illegal military-grade EMP weapon? And more importantly, who wanted Richard Vance dead so badly that they couldn't wait for him to go to federal prison? The FBI raided Vance's corporate headquarters. They seized his servers and brought in forensic accountants to tear apart the shadow ledger that the SEC had been investigating. What they found completely shifted the narrative of the assassination. Vance wasn't just stealing from blue-collar pension funds. To cover his massive trading losses, Vance had started quietly embezzling money from an offshore, highly encrypted holding company based in the Cayman Islands. The accountants traced the shell companies back to their true owners. The money Vance had stolen didn't belong to a teachers' union. It belonged to an international, highly organized criminal syndicate that used Vance's hedge fund to launder their illicit cash through the American stock market. Vance had stolen $300 million from a cartel. And a week before his death, Vance had signed a secret proffer agreement with the Department of Justice. He was preparing to turn over the cartel's entire laundering network in exchange for federal immunity and witness protection. The cartel couldn't just shoot him. If a cartel hitman gunned down a Wall Street CEO in broad daylight, the federal government would declare a total war. They needed Vance dead, but they needed it to look like a natural heart attack, so the FBI would simply close the file and walk away. They hired a high-tech assassin to execute the perfect, invisible murder. Chapter 6. The Magnetic Breadcrumbs. The FBI realized they were hunting a ghost operator who possessed military engineering skills and limitless cartel funding. They couldn't track the van using license plates. They couldn't track the assassin using fingerprints. But Detective Marcus Reed realized they had one distinct advantage. An EMP weapon that powerful doesn't just run on standard car batteries. It requires highly specialized, industrial-grade, high-voltage capacitors, the exact kind used in massive municipal power grids and particle accelerators. These components are strictly regulated by the federal government. You can't just buy them at a hardware store. The FBI Cyber Division began cross-referencing all dark web transactions and black market electronics purchases in the tri-state area over the past 6 months. They were looking for anyone who had illegally acquired military-grade pulse capacitors. 4 days later, a red flag popped up in the system. A shell company operating out of an abandoned warehouse in Brooklyn had recently imported 300 pounds of highly restricted high-voltage ceramic capacitors from an unregulated supplier in Eastern Europe. The FBI tactical teams mobilized. They had the address. They were going to breach the warehouse and take down the ghost in the white van. But as the SWAT trucks crossed the Brooklyn Bridge under the cover of darkness, the FBI didn't realize they were driving directly into a trap designed by a mastermind who had already anticipated their every move. Chapter 7. The Faraday Trap. The FBI hostage rescue team and NYPD ESU units didn't take any chances. They treated the abandoned Brooklyn warehouse like a hostile military compound. At 2 a.m., 30 heavily armed operators surrounded the perimeter. Snipers took positions on neighboring rooftops. The tactical commander gave the green light, and the breach team blew the heavy steel loading doors off their hinges with a brick-shaped C4 charge. The operators flooded into the dark, cavernous warehouse. Their night vision goggles painted the room in a bright, glowing green. Sitting in the dead center of the concrete floor was the faded white commercial utility van. The lead operator signaled his team to flank the vehicle. They moved in perfect, lethal silence. But as the lead operator reached for the van's rear door handle, he noticed a thick, heavy copper cable running from the van's undercarriage directly into the concrete floor. He didn't have time to yell a warning. A deafening, low-frequency mechanical hum vibrated through the soles of their boots. Instantly, the night vision goggles strapped to the operator's helmet sparked and went completely black. The tactical radios in their earpieces emitted a high-pitched squeal before dying entirely. Outside, the engines of the armored Bearcat transport vehicles sputtered and died. The streetlights on the entire block violently shattered. The killer hadn't just abandoned the van. He had turned the entire warehouse into a localized static EMP mine. He had wired the van's massive capacitors directly to the building's main electrical grid. When the breach team blew the doors, it triggered a proximity sensor discharging a massive electromagnetic shockwave. The operators were plunged into total blinding darkness. Their advanced optical sights were fried. Their comms were completely severed. By the time the tactical team ripped off their dead night vision goggles and pulled out physical glow sticks to secure the room, the warehouse was empty. The killer had used the momentary chaos and total technological blackout to slip out through a subterranean drainage tunnel. He had lured the FBI into a trap, blinded them, and vanished. Chapter 8: The Rogue Engineer. The FBI was completely humiliated. They realized they were fighting a ghost who possessed an intellect that rivaled their entire cyber division. Detective Marcus Reed and the FBI lead agents reconvened in the heavily shielded basement of the federal building in Manhattan. They knew they couldn't track this man using standard police work. They needed to profile the weapon, not the killer. They brought in a team of physicists from MIT. The scientists analyzed the burnt circuitry of the SWAT team's radios and the melted night vision goggles. This wasn't built in a garage from spare parts, the lead physicist explained. The pulse wavelength is perfectly calibrated to target silicon microprocessors while ignoring biological tissue. This is directed energy weaponry. This is military black ops technology. The FBI cross-referenced the technical signature of the EMP with a classified database of experimental weapons developers contracted by the Department of Defense. A single file matched the signature. The file belonged to a man named Nolan Cross. 10 years ago, Nolan Cross was a brilliant, highly cleared electrical engineer working for a defense contractor on a project dubbed Silent Strike, a program designed to build portable EMP rifles to disable enemy drones. But Cross was fired and stripped of his security clearance when military auditors discovered he had been secretly stealing the weapon schematics and attempting to sell them on the dark web. He managed to avoid prison due to a classified plea deal, but he had completely dropped off the grid. The cartel hadn't just hired a hitman, they had hired the exact engineer who invented the weapon. Chapter 9: The Shadow Ledger. The NYPD issued a massive tri-state manhunt for Nolan Cross. His face was plastered on every news station and digital billboard in New York. But Detective Reed knew that an operator like Cross wouldn't just hide in a motel. If Cross was exposed, logic dictated he would immediately flee the country. Yet, the federal port authorities and border checkpoints reported absolutely zero sightings. Reed went back to the motive. Why would the cartel pay millions of dollars to assassinate Richard Vance with a high-tech weapon, only to leave the assassin stranded in New York? Reed marched back into the evidence room and stared at the massive stack of computer servers the FBI had seized from Richard Vance's hedge fund. The servers containing the shadow ledger. The FBI accountants had been using these hard drives to trace the cartel's laundered money. The terrifying realization hit Reed like a physical blow. Killing Richard Vance was only phase 1. Vance was dead, but the digital evidence of the cartel's massive money laundering network was still perfectly intact, sitting right here in New York City. The cartel couldn't risk the FBI decrypting those servers. Nolan Cross didn't flee the country because his job wasn't finished. He had to destroy the servers. and the FBI was planning to transport those exact servers in a highly publicized, heavily guarded armored convoy down the interstate to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia at 6 a.m. the following morning. Chapter 10. The Faraday Convoy. Detective Reed rushed into the tactical commander's office. He explained that moving the servers tomorrow morning was exactly what Cross was waiting for. If he hits that convoy with a high-powered EMP on the highway, the engines on the armored trucks will instantly die, Reed explained. The convoy will be paralyzed, and the magnetic pulse will instantly wipe every single hard drive inside the truck, destroying the cartel's shadow ledger forever. The FBI tactical commander wanted to cancel the transport, but Reed shook his head. If we cancel it, he goes back into the shadows, and we never catch him. We use the convoy as bait. We let him strike. The commander argued that if Cross fired the weapon, the evidence would be destroyed. Not if we build a shield, Reed replied. The FBI worked frantically through the night. They couldn't outgun an electromagnetic pulse, but they could block it using a basic law of physics discovered in 1836, the Faraday cage. A Faraday cage is a continuous enclosure of conductive mesh that perfectly blocks electromagnetic fields. If an EMP hits a Faraday cage, the energy hits the mesh and safely travels around the exterior, completely protecting whatever is inside. The FBI engineers took the primary armored transport truck and meticulously wrapped the entire interior cargo hold in 3 layers of heavy, highly conductive copper mesh. They placed the shadow ledger servers inside the copper room. Then they retrofitted the truck's engine block with heavy lead shielding to protect the spark plugs and computer chips. By 5:30 a.m., the trap was set. Chapter 11. The Highway Intercept. At exactly 6 a.m., the armored convoy left the federal building in Manhattan. 2 heavily armed FBI SUVs led the way. The shielded transport truck drove in the center. 2 more SUVs trailed behind. They took the on-ramp to the New Jersey Turnpike, heading south toward Quantico. The sun was just beginning to rise over the industrial skyline. Detective Reed sat in the passenger seat of the lead SUV, his eyes scanning the sparse morning traffic. For 20 miles, nothing happened. Then, as the convoy passed over a long, elevated stretch of the highway surrounded by marshland, a heavy, unmarked black box truck accelerated down an entrance ramp, merging aggressively into the lane directly parallel to the FBI transport truck. Reed's radio crackled. "We have a bogey. Black box truck, left flank." Inside the back of the black truck, Nolan Cross was watching a live monitor. He had mounted his primary EMP cannon, a massive custom-built magnetic coil, pointing directly out the side wall of the truck. Cross aligned his vehicle perfectly with the FBI transport. He flipped the heavy safety toggles on his control board. The massive capacitors whined as they charged, drawing raw power from a bank of lithium batteries. Cross smiled, placed his finger on the firing mechanism, and pushed the button. Chapter 12. The Kinetic Takedown. An EMP is completely invisible, but the sheer displacement of energy is physically undeniable. The air between the black box truck and the FBI transport shimmered violently. A massive, silent wave of electromagnetic force slammed into the side of the armored FBI truck. Inside the black truck, Cross watched his monitors, expecting the FBI vehicle's engine to instantly die and the convoy to violently crash to a halt. But the armored truck didn't even swerve. Its engine roared, maintaining a perfect 65 miles per hour. Cross stared in absolute shock. He frantically hit the firing button again, discharging a second massive pulse. The magnetic wave slammed into the FBI truck, but the energy instantly grounded out against the triple-layered copper Faraday cage hidden beneath the armor plating. The massive electrical charge flowed safely around the exterior of the truck and dissipated into the rubber tires, leaving the servers and the engine block completely untouched. Because Cross had fired the weapon twice at maximum power without allowing the coils to cool down, his own capacitors catastrophically overloaded. A massive shower of sparks erupted in the back of the black truck. The EMP cannon physically melted, filling the cab with acrid, blinding smoke. Detective Reed gave the order over the radio. "Take him down." The two trailing FBI SUVs violently accelerated. They flanked the smoking black box truck. A massive armored Bearcat rammed the rear bumper, throwing Cross's truck into a violent spin. The box truck slammed into the concrete median, sparks raining across the highway, and ground to a complete halt. Before the smoke could clear, 20 heavily armed federal agents surrounded the cab, their assault rifles raised. Nolan Cross kicked the shattered door open and stumbled out onto the asphalt, raising his hands in surrender. The ghost had finally been grounded. Chapter 13. The Patek Philippe Legacy. The trial of Nolan Cross and the subsequent dismantling of the international cartel was a watershed moment for the Department of Justice. Because the Faraday cage had perfectly protected the servers, the FBI was able to decrypt Richard Vance's shadow ledger. The evidence led to a massive, coordinated federal sweep that resulted in the arrest of 47 high-ranking cartel operatives and corrupt financial executives across 3 continents. Nolan Cross refused to testify. He sat in the courtroom, arrogant and silent, believing the government could never definitively link him to the assassination of Richard Vance on Wall Street. But the prosecution didn't need a confession. During the trial, Detective Marcus Reed took the stand. He presented the jury with the burnt remnants of the EMP cannon recovered from the highway crash. Then he placed an evidence bag on the podium. Inside was the $2 million Patek Philippe Grand Complication. The FBI physicist testified that the highly specific unique magnetic frequency permanently trapped in the steel gears of the luxury watch was an exact, perfect match to the electromagnetic output of Nolan Cross's custom-built weapon. The watch was a flawless, irrefutable fingerprint. Nolan Cross was found guilty of first-degree murder, domestic terrorism, and federal racketeering. He was sentenced to life without parole at the ADX Florence Supermax prison. Richard Vance, a man who built his life on corruption and greed, died exactly as he lived, surrounded by luxury, entirely unaware of the invisible forces closing in around him. But in the end, it wasn't the FBI, the SEC, or the police who brought his killer to justice. It was a piece of perfect, unhackable 19th century Swiss engineering. A mechanical watch that stopped time recorded a ghost and proved that no matter how advanced the weapon, the laws of physics always leave a trace.